Welcome to Golden Blue, everybody, home of the college football fan. And don't forget about the checklist. Hat check, sunglasses check, Pepsi check, notes check, sources check, and thick skin is a check. And don't forget to sing gear to represent your team and yourself in my background. Send it to P.O. Box 360, Liberty, South Carolina, 29657, and get yourself a shout out. On to the next video. Whenever tax time rolls around, we will be extending our shelves all the way over to the door, so there will be more room. In case you're wondering, these are the teams that we don't have represented for the mini helmets. Tulane, SMU, Navy, East Carolina, Memphis, Tulsa, Temple, South Florida, UTSA, North Texas, UAB, FAU, Rice, Charlotte, Oregon, Utah, Washington State, Arizona, Cal, Stanford, Colorado, Louisville, NC State, Wake Forest, Boston College, Virginia, Georgia, South Carolina, Florida, Vanderbilt, Mississippi State, Ole Miss, Auburn, Texas A&M, Texas Tech, Cincinnati, Penn State, Maryland, Indiana, Rutgers, Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, Northwestern, James Madison, Coastal Carolina, Appalachian State, Georgia Southern, Georgia State, Old Dominion, Troy, South Alabama, Southern Miss, Louisiana, UL Monroe, Texas State, Arkansas State, Western Kentucky, Middle Tennessee, Louisiana Tech, Liberty, Sam Houston State, Jacksonville State, Notre Dame, UConn, UMass, Ohio, Buffalo, Bowling Green, Miami of Ohio, Kent State, Akron, Toledo, Eastern Michigan, Western Michigan, Ball State, Central Michigan, Northern Illinois, Wyoming, Colorado State, New Mexico, Fresno State, San Diego State, San Jose State, UNLV, Hawaii, and Nevada. The saga of the Pac-12 continues, and today it takes a little bit of a twist. Yes, this will be a Get It Gang video. If you're not familiar with Get It Gang, it's basically a name that I came up with for the group of people that come up with video ideas and put them in the comments section of my videos. So if you think you have a good video idea, leave them in the comments section and I just might use your comment. Sometimes people leave comments not meant to be a video idea, but I like it so much that I still use it for a video idea. So keep that in mind when you comment. But first, let's talk about our favorite college football conspiracist, MacGyver. Let's see what he has to say about the subject. Rumors swirling today that there may be merger talks brewing between Pac-12 and Big 12 again. The olive branch was extended by GK, George Kliavkoff, to BY, Brett Yormark, with terms that favor the Big 12 this time. We'll see if it gets traction. The result would be this, and thus ESPN would get the Pac-12 content and get it for around $20 million per school, less than their original but now pulled offer of $25 million. Fox gets Pac-10 content at a fantastic deal like they wanted, and Amazon gets content in all 4 time zones. He gets into the CFB game. He goes on to say this. One source tells me this is a desperation play from GK, George Kliavkoff, since the money isn't there that he promised his schools. He's trying to get them in the best position possible and then gracefully bow out. He says Pac-12 voted on SDSU, San Diego State, and SMU again and again did not get the 8 yes votes for either school. This happened sometime in the past few days. So yesterday, I thought it was San Diego State and SMU turning down the Pac-12. Turns out it might be the Pac-12 not getting enough votes to get them into the Pac-12. And finally, he says this. Interestingly enough, Cal and Stanford would not be part of this proposed merger. Not sure what's going on there yet. Just hearing preliminary info, but hearing it from multiple sources. Stay tuned. And now for the Get It Gang comments. The first one is from Stripes with 9 exclamation points. I still am convinced that both the Big 12 and the remaining schools in the Pac-12 will eventually merge and become a huge super conference. That way they can get a bigger and better TV deal. And finally, the last Get It Gang comment for this video is from Pat08 Mullins. I'm hearing Amazon is pulling out. Did you hear anything like this? If true, it's done. I really haven't heard about Amazon pulling out, but I have been hearing about this merger thing between the Pac-12 and the Big 12. And if you think about it, it makes everything make sense. Because from what I'm getting, Brett Yormark is going around to the team that the Pac-12 is trying to target and having talks with them, maybe discouraging them from joining the Pac-12 because either he wants teams from the Pac-12 or he wants to merge with the Pac-12. But if the Big 12 merges with the Pac-12, you better believe that Brett Yormark wants the terms in favor of the Big 12. That's why that tweet was very interesting to me by MacGyver, saying that the terms would be in favor of the Big 12 this go-around. Remember, they talked about it before and it fell through. So the first thing that this suggests is that Cal and Stanford could actually be headed to the Big Ten. Because in one of those tweets it says Cal and Stanford were not a part of that merger plan. So that would suggest that Cal and Stanford would be headed elsewhere. The only thing that makes sense would be the Big Ten. Remember, Oregon and Washington applied to the Big Ten. They actually turned them down. Maybe the Big Ten is eyeing Cal and Stanford. I've been saying that's what makes the most sense to me as far as the Big Ten grabbing 2 more teams from the Pac-12. Cal and Stanford have amazing academics. The next thing would be, if this merger happened, there would be 20 teams. This would be a super mega conference, and I do think the TV deal would be comparable to what the SEC and the Big Ten has. Not quite up there, but maybe in the range of 40 or 60 million per team per year. Here's what that 20-team conference would look like. Arizona State, Baylor, BYU, Cincinnati, Colorado, Houston, Iowa State, Kansas State, Oklahoma State, Oregon State, TCU, Texas Tech, UCF, Utah, Washington State, and West Virginia. That is not a bad-looking conference, and that is coast to coast, and it would cover those 4 time zones that Brett Yormark is wanting. So it checks all the boxes. That's why this makes sense. If this happens, I do think that the ACC would be in trouble because you'd have 3 mega conferences, the SEC with 16 members, the Big Ten with 16 members, and now the merger between the Pac-12 and the Big 12 with 20 members. So you better believe that the SEC and the Big Ten are looking to match that 20, and they would both want 4 teams each out of the ACC. That's when those 8 teams that are willing to vote to dissolve the grant of rights could hold that vote, actually vote to dissolve the grant of rights, because you know that the SEC and that the Big Ten would have promised spots for at least 4 teams out of that conference, which would make a total of 8 teams. What Notre Dame would do after that, I'm not sure. They would probably still remain independent, but for how long? Especially with the 12-team expansion, strongly encouraging Notre Dame to join a conference, because Notre Dame will never ever be able to get a bye week unless they're a member of a conference, because remember, the top 4 champions get that bye week. That's another interesting thing to think about. What if all this is trying to get Notre Dame to finally join a conference? And I'm sticking with what I think as far as what team's going where in the ACC. I think that it would be Florida State, North Carolina, Duke, and Georgia Tech to the Big Ten. On the other side, I would have Clemson, Miami Hurricanes, NC State, and Virginia to the SEC. But that would still leave some good brands that maybe the Big 12 could look at. I would really hope that they would consider bringing in Syracuse, Pitt, Louisville, and Virginia Tech. That would help out the East teams tremendously, especially West Virginia. Alright, what would this merger look like? Well, I gave you the list of teams, but there's 2 directions that they could go if this merger does happen. The first one is the 4 pods of 5 teams, and the second one is the 5 pods of 4 teams. Y'all let me know which one you like the best, and if there's any changes that you would make, let me know in the comments section. So the first one is the 4 pods of 5 teams. The first pod is the East Division. You'd have West Virginia, UCF, Cincinnati, Iowa State, and Houston. The next pod is the Central Pod. You'd have Kansas State, Oklahoma State, Colorado, and BYU. The third pod would be the Pacific Pod. You'd have Oregon State, Washington State, and Utah. And finally, the last pod would be the Southwest Pod. Arizona State, Texas Tech, Baylor, and TCU. But to be honest with you, in my opinion, I think the 5 pods of 4 teams makes even more sense. The first pod is the East Pod. West Virginia, UCF, Cincinnati, and Iowa State. The next pod would be the Texas Pod. Texas Tech, Baylor, TCU, and Houston. The third pod would be the Pacific Pod. Oregon State, Washington State. The fourth pod would be the Southwest Pod. Arizona State, BYU, and Utah. And finally, the last pod, the 5th pod, would be the Frontier Pod. Kansas State, Oklahoma State, and Colorado. I really like those 5 pods of 4 teams. I think this would make way more sense for scheduling as well. You could still schedule out of pods, of course you'd have to, because you only have 3 opponents within your pod, but you'd guarantee at least a little bit less travel if you did it this way. So y'all let me know in the comment section. Number 1, do you think this happens? Do you think that the Pac-12 and the Big 12 merge? Do you think this also suggests that Stanford and Cal are indeed headed to the Big 10? And if this merger does happen, do you think those 8 teams finally vote to dissolve the ACC grant of rights? The SEC gets their teams, the Big 10 gets their teams, and perhaps the Big 12 looks to get 4 more teams. And then finally, if this merger happens, which pod scenario did you like the most? The 4 pods of 5 teams or the 5 pods of 4 teams? And if you'd like to make any changes, which changes would you make to this? That's all I got for this show. Like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you on my next show.